Richard Calloway had calloused hands, a straight back, and absolutely no one waiting for him at home. Every morning before the sun had fully committed to rising, he was already out on his land checking fences, feeding cattle, hauling water from the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property. He did it all alone, had done it alone for 11 years. The ranch wasn't much to look at from the road, a modest farmhouse with a patched roof, two large barns that leaned slightly to the left like tired old men, and about 200 head of cattle that Richard knew by behavior if not by name. The land was dry and demanding, the kind that only rewarded a man who refused to quit. Richard had never quit anything in his life. Quitting, he figured, was a luxury for men who had someone around to talk them out of it. Dusthaven, Texas was the kind of town that knew everybody's business before they knew it themselves. It sat along a well-traveled trail route, which meant it had grown faster than it had matured. There was a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a courthouse on Wednesdays, 3 saloons that didn't double as anything respectable, and enough gossip to fill every one of them. The people were hardworking and proud, the way frontier people tended to be, but they also had opinions, and they shared them freely. Their opinion of Richard Calloway was simple: decent man, hard worker, lost cause. Too quiet, the women at the dry goods store would say, shaking their heads with a strange mixture of pity and finality. A man that doesn't talk much is a man hiding something sad. The men respected him well enough. He never borrowed without returning, never started trouble, always showed up when a neighbor needed an extra hand at branding season. But respect and warmth were different currencies in Dusthaven, and Richard had only ever been paid in one of them. He ate his supper alone. He mended his fences alone. He sat on his porch in the blue hour between dusk and dark, alone, listening to the cattle shift and breathe in the distance. He had grown so accustomed to solitude that he had stopped noticing the silence, the way a man who lives near a river eventually stops hearing the water. There had been someone once, a woman named Clara, 7 years back. She had looked at his ranch, looked at his rough hands, and told him gently but clearly that she needed a man who could give her more than dirt and distance. She hadn't said it cruelly. That almost made it worse. He had never entirely recovered from the quiet way she'd said it, as though she were simply stating something obvious that he ought to have already known about himself. He hadn't courted anyone since. It was on a Tuesday in late October when Richard first spoke more than 3 words to Erica Valdez, though he wouldn't have called it speaking so much as doing what needed doing. He had been riding back from the feed mill when he spotted her wagon stopped dead on the south road. One wheel dropped clean off the axle, tilted sideways like it had simply given up. She was standing beside it with her arms folded, composed in the way that beautiful women in difficult situations often force themselves to be. Richard dismounted without fanfare. He assessed the wheel, retrieved the tools from his saddlebag, and set the axle right in under 20 minutes. He worked without commentary. When it was done, he replaced his tools, nodded once, and moved to remount his horse. "I didn't catch your name," Erica said. "Richard Calloway," he said, without turning fully around. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He nodded again and rode on. He didn't think about it afterward, but she did. That same evening, on the other end of Dusthaven, Sheriff Dale Holt stood outside the Valdez Mercantile, hat in hand, smiling the wide smile of a man already certain of the answer, and loudly declared his intention to court Erica Valdez before winter arrived. The whole town assumed it was already settled. Richard was mending a section of fence along his north pasture when he heard hoofbeats on his property. He didn't look up immediately. Visitors to his ranch were rare enough that he assumed it was a neighbor with a stray animal or a question about grazing land. He finished hammering the post he was working on, set his mallet down, and turned around. Erica Valdez was sitting astride a brown mare, dressed practically in a dark riding coat and boots, her dark hair pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She looked entirely out of place on his scrubby, wind-worn ranch, and entirely unbothered by that fact. Richard stared at her for a moment. "Miss Valdez, Mr. Calloway." She dismounted smoothly and tied her horse to the fence post he had just repaired. "I need to speak with you about something important. I'd rather not take long about it, so I'll be direct." "All right," he said slowly. She met his eyes without flinching. "I'd like you to marry me." The words landed in the dry afternoon air like a stone dropped into still water. Richard said nothing for a long moment. A cattle bird called somewhere behind him. He picked up his mallet, looked at it for no particular reason, and set it back down. "You're serious," he finally said. "I don't ride 4 miles to make jokes, Mr. Calloway." He studied her face carefully, searching for the angle because there had to be one. Women like Erica Valdez did not ride out to struggling cattle ranches and propose to men like Richard Calloway without a reason buried somewhere underneath the words. He had lived long enough to know that much. "What's happened?" he asked. She didn't look away. "Sheriff Holt has been extorting my father for 2 years, threatening to fabricate violations against the mercantile, tie him up in legal trouble, bleed him dry through fines and fees he has the authority to invent. The price for stopping, the only price Holt will accept, is me." Richard's jaw tightened. "My father is not a weak man," Erica continued, her voice steady. "But he is a cornered one, and I refuse to be handed over like a parcel of land to a man who uses his badge as a weapon." She paused. "If I marry someone else, someone Holt cannot easily threaten or remove, his leverage disappears." "There are other men in this town," Richard said carefully. "There are," she agreed. "Men with more money, more land, more standing." She took one step closer. "But I've watched you for longer than you know, Richard Calloway. I watched you give half your winter feed supply to the Greer family when their barn burned, and tell no one. I watched you sit with old Tom Briggs for 2 hours outside the doctor's office last spring, because the man had no one else. I watched you fix my wheel and ride away without once looking back to see if I was impressed." Richard was quiet. "You are the only man in Dusthaven who does good things without an audience," she said. "And you are the only man I believe has the character to stand against Holt without being bought or broken." The late afternoon light stretched long across the pasture. Richard looked out at his land, the weathered barns, the cattle grazing without urgency, the life he had built with no one in it. Then Clara's voice came to him, as it sometimes did in quiet moments. "A man who has nothing to offer." He had carried those words for 7 years like stones in a coat pocket, so long he'd forgotten he was still carrying them. "It wouldn't be only about Holt," Erica said quietly, as though she could hear the exact shape of his hesitation. "I wouldn't ask you if I didn't mean it fully." Richard looked at her for a long moment, then something in his chest that had been braced for a very long time slowly, carefully released. "All right," he said. 2 hours later, Dusthaven was talking about nothing else. Sheriff Holt heard the news before supper, and his easy smile disappeared entirely. Sheriff Dale Holt was not a man who accepted losing gracefully. Within 3 days of the engagement becoming public, cattle began disappearing from Richard's north pasture. 6 head gone the first night, 4 more the second. By the third morning, 2 of Richard's ranch hands reported finding his brand burned over on cattle spotted near the county stockyard, registered under a false name that nobody in Dusthaven recognized. The implication was clear and deliberate. Holt was building a case, brick by manufactured brick, and wearing his badge the entire time he did it. The town watched nervously. Most people liked Richard well enough, but liking a man and standing beside him against the sheriff were 2 entirely different commitments. Dusthaven went quiet in that particular way small towns go quiet when trouble is about to land on someone, hushed, watchful, and carefully uninvolved. What nobody knew, except Richard, was that he had seen this coming. 6 weeks earlier, shortly after Erica had first approached him, and before he had given her his answer, Richard had spent 4 days riding quietly between neighboring properties. He hadn't announced himself loudly or made speeches. He had simply sat with people, farmers, merchants, a widowed seamstress on the edge of town, 2 saloon workers who had never been asked their opinion about anything, and he had listened. What came out once people felt safe enough to speak was a catalog of Sheriff Holt's corruption stretching back nearly 3 years, fabricated fines, seized goods never logged, threats made in private that left no visible marks. Richard had written every word down in a worn leather journal. Names, dates, descriptions. He had then sent a careful letter, through a freight rider he trusted, to the circuit judge based out of San Antonio, outlining what he had gathered and requesting a scheduled visit to Dusthaven at the earliest convenience. Judge Harlan Moore arrived on a Thursday, presented simply as a traveler passing through. He took a room above the quietest saloon and asked no loud questions. The confrontation happened the following morning. Richard walked into the center of Dusthaven's Main Street at 9 o'clock, journal in hand, and asked in a clear, carrying voice for the town's attention. Erica stood beside him. Her father stood on his right. And Judge Moore, no longer pretending to be a passing traveler, stood slightly behind with the full authority of the Texas Circuit Court resting on his shoulders. Holt came out of his office with his hand already near his holster, his expression arranged into righteous offense. "Calloway, you'd better have a strong reason for this circus." "I do," Richard said simply. He opened the journal. What followed was not dramatic in the way of dime novels. Richard didn't shout. He didn't perform. He read name by name, incident by incident. In the same steady voice he used to give instructions to his ranch hands. Every person named in that journal was standing somewhere in the gathered crowd. As Richard read, they stepped forward one by one, confirming what was written. The seamstress, the farmer from the South Road, Erica's father finally speaking aloud what he had been silenced into keeping private for 2 years. Holt's confidence collapsed in stages, first bluster, then argument, then a silence that said everything. Judge Moore stepped forward and made it official. By noon, Dale Holt was in his own jail cell, stripped of his badge, awaiting transport to San Antonio. The town stood in the street for a long while afterward, not entirely sure what to do with the sudden absence of fear they had grown so accustomed to carrying. 3 weeks later, Richard Calloway and Erica Valdez were married in the Dusthaven church on a bright Saturday morning. The ceremony was simple. The attendance was not nearly every soul in town filled the pews, which surprised Richard considerably. "Did you expect otherwise?" Erica whispered, watching his expression. "Honestly," he said, "yes." She took his hand. "You've always underestimated what people see in you." He looked at her, this woman who had ridden 4 miles to choose him when he hadn't thought himself choosable, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he believed it. The ranch no longer felt like a place a man disappeared into. It felt at last like somewhere worth coming home to.